She passed the stuffing tray across me like I was invisible. Her hand didn't graze mine. Her eyes didn't lift. She was too busy laughing at some story her lawyer was telling, something about private arbitration loopholes and emergency custody filings. I poured myself a second glass of Pinot and forced a smile as Rachel topped off his wine before even noticing my glass was empty. It was our condo, my grandmother's dining table, my name on the mortgage, but you wouldn't have known it. I was a ghost in my own home, politely refilling plates like a well-trained waiter. Rachel, in her black silk dress, had that smirk she wore when she was holding cards no one else had seen yet. She always liked being the smartest person in the room, even when the room was filled with people she'd invited for one reason: to impress them with how far she'd upgraded from her humble beginnings. That meant showcasing me as an accessory, nothing more. The loyal, aging husband with a pension and good posture. I should have left right after dessert, but the pie was store-bought, and the guests were drunk enough not to care. I slipped out to the hallway, just wanted a break from the noise. There was a little service cart by the guest room door with a bottle of scotch I'd hidden months ago behind the cleaning rags. That's when I heard her voice. Muffled, but clear. I don't care how we do it. Once I frame him for misconduct, I'll take the house, the accounts, everything. I didn't move. My hand stopped mid-pour. Don't worry, I've already got the first draft, her lawyer chuckled. But are you sure he's that stupid? Then Rachel, my wife, my partner of 22 years, replied with a little laugh of her own. He's been a background extra his whole life. That sentence should have shattered me, but it didn't. It clarified something, like fog lifting off a lake in the morning. I screwed the cap back on the scotch and walked, calmly, back into my study. The drawer was already labeled, in case of war. I put the label there 5 years ago during her first flirtation with divorce threats. Not because I was paranoid, but because I've lived long enough to know how people turn when they think you're finished. And Rachel had always been more chessboard than heart. I opened the drawer. One file, one clause, one signature. She had no idea. She thought I was just some retired consultant with a dusty pension and a weak backbone. What she didn't know, what she'd never bothered to ask, was that the very clause she was about to trip over. I wrote it. Years ago, hidden inside the compliance shell of a firm her own lawyer used boilerplate contracts from. I buried it not to trap her, but to protect myself. And now she'd given me the one thing I needed: cause. Look, more than 90% of you listening probably aren't subscribed. But if you like stories where justice doesn't show up in a courtroom, but in cold, brutal silence, hit that button. It keeps this engine running and motivates the team to keep going. Now, where were we? Right, clause 11.b. She thought I wouldn't see it coming. She had no idea the bomb was already under her chair. There's a strange calm that comes over you when your enemy hands you the knife and assumes you won't use it. I sat in my study the next morning, staring at the file like it had aged with me. Yellowing edges, a little rust on the staple, my signature fading but intact. 30 years ago, I was working under Robert Ainsley, a compliance architect who treated bylaws the way surgeons treat scalpels. We weren't just writing legal templates. We were embedding insurance policies into corporate DNA. Back then, Clause 11.b was just an academic idea, a failsafe buried deep inside employee protections, meant to neutralize bad faith legal maneuvering. Whistleblower shielding. Safeguard against internal sabotage. It was my contribution. At the time, Robert called it the razor under the floorboard. No one would know it was there, until it cut. I hadn't thought about that clause in over a decade. Not until I heard Rachel tell her lawyer she was going to frame me. That word didn't just hurt. It activated something in me. A switch I didn't even remember wiring into myself. I wasn't sad. I wasn't betrayed. I was precise. I picked up the landline. Yes, I still use one. And dialed a number I hadn't called in 15 years. 3 rings. Then, Griffin. Still have access to the 2002 corporate templates? A pause. Then the cautious chuckle of a man who remembers secrets. Only the paranoid ones. What? I'm triggering clause 11.b. Long silence. I could hear a coffee mug being set down. She doesn't know you wrote it, does she? No. Another pause. This time it stretched. Well, he exhaled. She's about to find out. Clause 11.b was more than legal language. It was a loaded mechanism. When activated, it forced a complete asset freeze on both parties involved in any corporate-adjacent divorce litigation, pending internal compliance review. It didn't care who was guilty. It cared who was clean. And the only way to stay clean was to never initiate a bad faith move. Rachel just declared war using my own playbook. But that wasn't the part that amused me. The real irony? Her firm, the one representing her, still used the original template from the Ainsley Protocol, version 4.2. She never knew that the documents her lawyer considered standard protective language were born in a conference room I used to nap in during lunch breaks. I even named the clause after an inside joke, 11 for the number of days Robert's ex-wife stalled before signing the divorce papers, B because she always called him a bastard. She thought I was a background extra. I was the screenwriter. By that evening, Griffin had forwarded me the notarized version of the clause, updated and digitally sealed. He even threw in an old scan of our original draft, just in case someone tried to argue authorship. The email came with a short note. Here's your razor. Happy cutting. I printed it out, placed it in a red folder labeled Trigger, and slid it beneath my cufflinks drawer, right above the backup burner phone and a safety deposit key Rachel never knew existed. If she wanted to drag me through the mud, she better pack a snorkel, because the deeper she dug, the faster she was going to drown. I wasn't angry. I was focused. She started with the garden variety niceties. I've been thinking a lot about legacy, she said one morning over coffee, her tone soaked in faux warmth. We should really take a deeper look at our estate, get everything in order. For the kids, you know. There were no kids. We'd never had any, by choice, or at least I thought. She'd always insisted her career came first. Now, suddenly, she was talking about family trusts and next-generation planning like she was preparing for sainthood. I stirred my coffee and nodded. Sounds wise, I said, and mentally marked the date. Within the week, I received an invitation to a meeting she scheduled through a third-party financial consultant, someone I didn't recognize. The attached document was a bland spreadsheet of joint holdings, but the formatting told me everything. Her lawyer had redlined it. Columns shifted. Language changed. My name was conveniently minimized, barely there except where liability was concerned. But the real tip-off came 3 days later when Rachel's attorney, same guy from the Thanksgiving dinner, accidentally copied an HR contact from my former firm on an email chain discussing my unorthodox handling of retirement asset distribution. Unorthodox, in this case, meaning completely fabricated. The attachment was a mock complaint. Fake entries. A digital paper trail he must have hired someone to create. Rachel didn't mention it at dinner that night. She just smiled as she passed me the salt and asked if I'd remembered to sign the estate planning forms she left by the printer. She's confident, my attorney, Monique, said, fanning through the printouts a few days later. Too confident. She had been with me since my Ainsley days. Sharp. Unsentimental. She flipped a page and pointed to a line that claimed I'd backdated a trust transfer. Impossible, since that transaction was public record and had a timestamp certified by the custodial firm. She's not trying to win a case, Monique murmured. She's trying to cast just enough doubt to force a settlement. Dirty, fast, and designed to look procedural. I leaned back. She thinks this is chess, I said. But she's playing Jenga. She just hasn't heard the first crack yet. There was something almost tragic about the elegance of her plan. It was all theater. She needed me to panic, to yell, to fight. Any response she could point to as proof of instability or guilt. That's why she smirked every time she handed me another friendly financial document to sign. Why she cooed things like, I just want what's fair, while quietly siphoning off joint accounts into premarital reserves she claimed she'd forgotten to disclose earlier. I said nothing. I signed nothing. I let her think she was 3 moves ahead. What she didn't realize was that by initiating a falsified complaint, she had already breached the ethical parameters of Clause 11.b. And more importantly, she'd unknowingly allowed her law firm to become complicit. They thought they were building a noose. I was watching them tie it around their own legs. One night, I caught her in the den rehearsing. She didn't see me. She had a glass of red in one hand and was speaking into a handheld recorder like she was delivering testimony. Glenn began acting erratic. I was worried about his memory. I didn't want to embarrass him, but I had to protect myself. She even practiced wiping away fake tears. I didn't interrupt. I just closed the door quietly and went to bed. Let her build her stage. I'd already written the final act. They call me in on a Tuesday. Quiet email. No subject line, just a, hey Glenn, when you have a moment type of thing. That kind of email always means they're about to ask if you stole something or slept with someone. The office hadn't changed much since I'd left. Same scuffed tile floors, same framed motivational quotes that felt like passive-aggressive threats. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching. I'd walked past that one for 17 years. Now it stared back at me like a dare. HR was waiting. 2 of them, actually. One I recognized, Diane. The other was new. Young guy. Nervous. He stood when I walked in like I was royalty. Diane didn't. She offered a weak smile and gestured toward the seat across from her. Glenn, thanks for coming in. Of course. What's this about? She cleared her throat and slid a folder across the table. The paper inside was heavy, glossy, the kind of paper lawyers use when they want intimidation baked into the fibers. We received an anonymous tip. It alleges that you may have altered certain retirement asset entries during your final year here. Backdating contributions. Adjusting valuation inputs without compliance approval. She didn't meet my eyes when she said it. That was my first confirmation they knew it was crap. I didn't flinch. I just reached into my briefcase and pulled out a sealed red envelope. Unbroken tamper-proof strip. Date stamped from 6 months ago. Hand-delivered by Griffin's assistant the morning after Thanksgiving. I placed it in the center of the table like a live grenade. Inside, you'll find complete logs from the custodial software vendor, I said, calmly. Timestamps, encryption hashes, audit trails. You'll also find sworn affidavits from 2 third-party auditors who reviewed my retirement allocations. Every entry is clean. The young guy opened the envelope like it was radioactive. His eyebrows shot up on the second page. Diane kept her hands folded tightly on the table. And this, I added, sliding one last document across with 2 fingers, is Clause 11.b. The font was cold and surgical. Highlighted in pale gray was the trigger condition. If one party initiates or knowingly cooperates with a knowingly falsified legal action for the purpose of gaining financial leverage, all jointly held or interrelated assets shall be immediately frozen and subject to review under fiduciary preservation standards. Diane blinked. Wait, this isn't from our legal team. It's older, I said. From the original framework your firm adopted back in 2002. You're still using it, by the way. You updated the branding, but not the bones. The young guy looked at Diane like he'd just seen a ghost. He's right, he whispered. This is still in the compliance doc set. I leaned back and smiled, flat and cold. Congratulations. You've activated it. Diane didn't say a word. She just closed the folder like it was a coffin lid. Clause 11.b was a virus embedded in the structure of their protections. It didn't require a judge. It didn't even require agreement. The clause simply functioned once triggered. And Rachel's lawyer, by ghostwriting that anonymous tip, had just detonated it. By lunch, the firm's internal legal server was pinging with auto-freeze protocols. Accountants were locked out of financials. Her name, Rachel Masters, was tagged with a review flag under 2 internal systems she didn't even know existed. And her law firm's compliance officer had just received a quiet notification of an inherited fiduciary disruption event. She'd fired the first shot, but she'd triggered the minefield underneath her own army. It's poetic, really, how fast a single sheet of paper can light an entire house on fire. No cover letter, no legalese, no threats. Just one crisp page, faxed to 3 destinations. Her attorney's office, her firm's general counsel, and the Ethics Compliance Division of the State Bar. I printed the clause in 14-point font, large enough for even the most arrogant eyes to read without squinting, and highlighted the operative sentence in bright, angry yellow. Clause 11.b. In the event of any false or malicious legal maneuvering by a spouse tied to corporate interests, all joint assets are frozen, and ownership reverts to the party maintaining clean fiduciary standing. No signature, no return number, just the clause. I sent it at 9:47 a.m. By 9:56, my phone rang. What the hell is Clause 11.b? The voice belonged to her attorney, Marshall Greer. Smooth when he's winning, hysterical when cornered. I let him scream for a full 10 seconds before responding. It's the clause your firm has been using for over 20 years, Marshall. You'd know that if you'd actually read the base compliance templates instead of just copy-pasting them into divorce filings. You planted this thing in the documents. You weaponized the template. I didn't even bother correcting him. I just waited. He continued. You're bluffing. This isn't enforceable. Oh, but it is, I replied calmly. You'll want to check the internal compliance binding authority on fiduciary entanglement clauses. Section 7, subsection D. And while you're at it, call your own general counsel. She got the same fax. Click. I leaned back and watched my inbox explode. 2 new emails from her firm's document control system. One from their internal auditing queue. A red flag notice from their retention compliance software. And then came the cherry on top, a bounce-back notification. The shared digital folders that Rachel's lawyer had been using to stage our estate documents were now locked and read-only. The clause had triggered the firm's auto-freeze protocol, an old but brutal safeguard designed to prevent insider fraud. No one could alter anything now, not even her. For the first time in years, Rachel's team didn't just lose control, they lost certainty. The kind of certainty attorneys trade in like currency. And without it, they were just angry people in tailored suits, swatting at smoke they couldn't contain. The fax was my way of flipping the light switch in a room full of roaches. The moment they saw the clause was real, codified, time-stamped, and recognized by their own systems, they scattered. At 10:04, Rachel called. I didn't answer. At 10:07, Marshall called again. This time, he left a voicemail. He tried to sound composed, but his voice cracked halfway through. We need to talk. This clause, this could create a massive liability issue for the firm. If it becomes public, Jesus, Glenn, what do you even want? I wanted silence. I wanted them to stew in it. But more than anything, I wanted Rachel to realize just how little she'd known about the man she thought she could erase. She thought she was burying me under legal paperwork. She didn't realize she was burying herself under mine. The wheels came off fast. Marshall tried to claw his way back into control, of course. Men like him always think volume is a strategy. By noon, he was firing off rebuttal memos and contextual clarifications to anyone with a title, desperately trying to downplay Clause 11, be like it was some dusty relic I'd dredged up to stall a divorce. He even emailed their in-house compliance officer, a woman named Janine Hallbrook, asking for a review of the legitimacy and enforceability of legacy clauses not currently in active procedural circulation. In simpler terms, please tell me this isn't real. Janine called a meeting instead. Not an email, not a memo, a meeting with legal, ethics, IT, and, crucially, board liaison staff. I wasn't there, obviously, but Monique was. She was looped in under the old Ainsley protocol. They didn't know that, of course. Apparently, the first thing Janine said when she walked into the conference room was, "So, who didn't read the base structure?" Dead silence. Then she turned to Marshall and asked, calmly, "You didn't do due diligence?" That's when the real panic started. Turns out, Clause 11.b wasn't just active, it was auditable. The system logs showed it had been in place for over 2 decades and had never once been triggered until now. Which meant this wasn't just an oversight. It was a compliance time bomb that had finally gone off under their feet. Rachel, to her credit, tried to act composed. She leaned on her reputation like it was body armor. But in a firm that survives on donor trusts and executive discretion, the worst thing you can do isn't making a mistake. It's exposing liability. And now she was liability incarnate. By 3:30 p.m., she was summoned to a closed-door ethics session. No lawyer present. Just her, Janine, and 2 board liaisons. The next time she appeared in the office, she was pale, silent, and accompanied by HR. She was placed on administrative leave pending internal review, which is lawyer speak for, start cleaning out your office before we make it formal. The woman who had been a star litigator, the one who smiled over Thanksgiving dinner and said I'd never see it coming, was now a silent shadow walking past interns who wouldn't even make eye contact. Meanwhile, at my house, a white envelope arrived by courier. Inside, a formal apology letter, firm letterhead, signed by the general counsel. Regret for misunderstandings, unauthorized use of firm resources, and potential reputational impact. I read it once. Then I folded it, filed it under unanswered, and slid it next to my copy of Clause 11.b. They wanted a reaction. They got silence. You see, I wasn't playing defense anymore. That part of the game was over. The moment she turned our marriage into a legal war zone, she assumed I'd scramble for cover. Instead, I built my own bunker, inside her own firm's architecture, and waited. And now she wasn't just losing a case. She was becoming the case. She picked the restaurant we used to go to on anniversaries. The one with the overpriced truffle risotto and dim lighting that made everyone feel younger. A jazz trio played in the corner like it was 1958, and every candle flickered like it had a secret. I arrived 3 minutes late, on purpose. Rachel was already there, hair pinned back the way she used to wear it in court, glass of wine half full, smile preloaded. She stood when I approached, another tell. Rachel never stood unless she wanted something. "Glenn," she said softly, as if I were a wounded animal. "You look well. Healthy resentment is good for the skin," I replied, pulling out my chair. We went through the motions like diplomats after a war. Small talk. Real estate prices. Something about one of her friends buying a house in the Berkshires. I nodded at the right places and let her pretend we were 2 civil people catching up. 2 grown-ups. Maybe even a pair of wise elders. laughing off the mistakes of youth. But the problem was, she still thought I was the man who hadn't seen it coming. The wine arrived. She swirled hers, then leaned forward, elbows on the table in a posture of forced vulnerability. I may have overreacted, she said carefully. I looked at her. Not angry, not bitter, just looking. I'm just glad we're speaking civilly, I replied, mirroring her tone. She smiled, a little too wide, then reached across the table, her fingers grazing mine, slow and deliberate. Like we were back in our 30s, like none of this had ever happened. I didn't move my hand. The silence lingered longer than it should have. She withdrew, brushing it off with a sip of wine. But I saw it, that millisecond flicker of recognition. She no longer had the script. I also brought something, I said, reaching into my coat. Her smile faltered. I set a sealed manila envelope on the white linen tablecloth. No markings, no label, just thick enough to be dangerous. Consider this, I said, a mirror. She blinked. What is it? Perspective. She didn't touch it right away. She just stared at it like it might bite. Her hand hovered above it, but she pulled back and laughed softly, trying to deflect. Is this another clause, Glenn? Some old file you're going to fax to Jesus next? I tilted my head. Open it at home. The waiter brought our entrees. She barely touched hers. I ate slowly, deliberately. It wasn't about the food, it was about the space. The difference between us now was no longer emotional. It was architectural. I'd rebuilt the ground beneath my feet. She was still trying to balance on the ruins. When the check came, she reached for it instinctively. I let her. That, too, was a small demolition. Outside, the air was crisp and damp, the kind of cold that lingers on your collar. She lingered, unsure whether to hug me or say something theatrical. I'm glad we talked, she finally said. I looked at her, really looked, and saw, for the first time, the erosion. Not just stress or guilt. Something deeper. Like the scaffolding that had held her up for years was finally creaking. I'm glad you'll read that, I said, nodding to the envelope still clutched in her hand. And then I walked away. No look back. No final word. She had her mirror. She just didn't know yet what it would show. She didn't open it that night. Not immediately. I knew she'd stare at the envelope first, maybe pour herself a second glass of wine, try to guess what was inside. She'd circle it like a cat does with a box it's not sure it fits in. Part of her still thought it might be a desperate plea. An olive branch. A love letter from the man she once knew. The man she thought she broke. It wasn't. By the time she finally slit the flap open with her nail, slowly, dramatically, as if she were defusing a bomb, the contents spilled out with the quiet certainty of a closing cell door. On top, screenshots. Full-resolution stills of a waveform monitor, courtesy of my own in-home security audio log. Yes, the same one she'd mocked me for setting up, in case the cleaning lady stole your cufflinks. Time-stamped, clipped, and transcribed. Her voice, crisp and unmistakable. I don't care how we do it. Once I frame him. The next document. A word-for-word transcript of her conversation with Marshall, recorded through the same baby monitor system she used to test her podcast setup. She hadn't realized the system was linked to the cloud. She also hadn't realized I'd never stopped paying for the premium storage. She flipped through the pages, fast at first, then slower. You could almost hear the denial bleeding out of her. Then came the memo. Letterhead from her firm's Ethics and Compliance Committee. Formal language. Cold phrasing. Effective immediately, Rachel Masters is to be placed on indefinite suspension pending a full investigation into allegations of professional misconduct and breach of fiduciary responsibility. She would have recognized the internal phrasing. It meant her future wasn't in question. It was finished. She paused. There was one last page. Cover sheet. Simple, stark type. Filed but not yet submitted. Underneath that header, a list of agencies. Bar Association. Judicial Review Council. Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Her firm's largest client's in-house legal department. A well-known journalist who covers high-profile legal misconduct in the journal. And then, just two final lines. Handwritten. One more lie. And this becomes public record. She dropped the envelope on the table. Her wineglass tipped. Didn't shatter, just wobbled, spilled slowly across the marble like a crime scene in slow motion. She didn't cry. Not yet. Rachel never cried until it was over. And it wasn't quite over. What she saw, in that moment, wasn't just evidence. It was structure. A lattice of facts she couldn't untangle. Every lie, every scheme, every smug smile. Caught, time-stamped, prepared, and ready for detonation. The trap she tried to build for me had become a fully reinforced cage around her. And worse, She didn't know how much else I was holding back. That's when the power dynamic shifted, finally and irreversibly. She wasn't wondering how to win. She was wondering how long she had before the world saw her for what she was. Her reflection had arrived, and it looked exactly like her. The first official domino to fall was her lawyer. At 8:12 a.m., Marshall Greer filed a motion to withdraw from all representation of Rachel Masters, citing irreconcilable breakdown in client-attorney communication. That was the polite version. The real story, of course, was that Marshall had been cornered by his own firm's compliance officer and asked one very simple question. Did you fabricate, participate in, or fail to report a strategy to create false allegations against a former partner for financial gain? There's no good answer to that question. Silence is admission. Denial is obstruction. So Marshall did what men like him always do when the water gets too high. He bailed. By noon, Rachel's name had been removed from her firm's website. Her email was deactivated. Her access badge flagged. The official statement came an hour later, buried in a press release about organizational restructuring and ongoing internal review of procedural ethics. The real dagger, though, was the subheader tucked at the bottom. Ms. Masters will be on extended leave pending outcome. Internally, she was radioactive. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her network evaporated. That's the thing about power built on perception. It turns out it's lighter than ash when the air changes. Then came the money. Every joint account she thought she'd strategically repositioned had already been frozen under the automatic parameters of Clause 11.b. Compliance officers from both firms, mine and hers, had executed the freeze with surgical speed. The moment the clause was validated, it didn't just protect me. It stripped her of any access to funds that hadn't been entirely her own. And she didn't have much that was. Even worse, her mother's trust. That account, the one she'd long used like her personal emergency fund, was technically still shared, co-managed, jointly signed. But I'd been added as a safeguard years ago, at her mother's request, when early signs of cognitive decline surfaced. Rachel had never cared, never even read the documents. Now, it meant that every withdrawal required my signature, and mine wasn't coming. At precisely 2:03 p.m., I received a bank notification. Transaction request, signature denied. She tried to move $8,000. Rent, maybe, or legal fees. Hard to tell, but either way, denied. By dusk, her credit cards were pinging with declined transactions. The audits had begun. Forensic teams were picking through every movement of her accounts over the last year. Anything that smelled like strategic positioning was flagged, paused, investigated. She had no funds, no firm, no fallback, just a Mercedes on lease and a closet full of suits she could no longer wear anywhere respectable. And then, like clockwork, she showed up at my doorstep. The driveway camera caught her. Hair tied back, no makeup, hoodie over what looked like the same blouse she wore during our retreat dinner. She stood there for almost 5 minutes, shifting her weight, arms folded, then unfolded, then folded again. Finally, she rang the bell. Twice. I watched the alert flash across my phone. I watched her wait. I saw her lips move, maybe rehearsing some final version of, "I'm sorry," or "We can fix this," or "Please, Glenn." I didn't answer. She tried the door handle. Locked. She leaned her forehead against the glass like it might melt. Still, I didn't move. Because silence, by then, wasn't just power, it was punishment. She'd always believed control came from speaking louder, moving first, bluffing better. But I'd written a clause that required none of those things. Just patience and precision. And now, all that remained around her was rubble. Quiet. Permanent. Monday morning arrived like a courtroom verdict. Quiet. Final. And utterly indifferent to the emotions involved. Rachel sat alone in what was left of her corner office. Desk half cleared, credentials revoked, inbox reduced to spam and auto-replies. The overhead lights hummed like they were mocking her, and the framed diploma on the wall now felt like a relic from a different life. At 9:41 a.m., a courier knocked. No greeting, just a stiff nod as he handed over a legal envelope, notarized and tagged with urgent handling. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside, a formal declaration of trust reallocation. Glenn had moved all remaining marital assets, accounts, properties, residuals, into a protected financial instrument registered under a preservation clause embedded in the same legal architecture she once claimed to have mastered. The justification was short and lethal. Clause 11.b, subsection 3. In cases of demonstrated malicious financial targeting, The clean fiduciary may unilaterally transfer joint assets into a preservation trust pending full audit and disbursement control. Her name was nowhere. At the bottom, typed in bold, signed with full legal authority, G. Masters. She didn't cry. Not yet. She picked up her phone and dialed his number, the one she used to call to complain about meetings or ask if he remembered to pick up eggs. It rang once. Then voicemail. No greeting. No warmth. Just the generic system message. She stared at the screen for a long time before typing one final message. Please, can we talk? It sat there. Delivered. Read. No reply. She threw the phone on the desk, breathing sharp and shallow. Somewhere in the building, someone laughed. Not at her, just at something unrelated. But it hit her like shrapnel. Meanwhile, at a small FedEx branch a few blocks away, a final fax machine fed 3 pages into the glass mouth of the scanner. The destinations were already programmed. Her former board of directors, the State Ethics Committee, a freelance investigative journalist who had been BCC'd on the earlier correspondence. The fax title was plain. Final addendum, timeline of events. No legal jargon. No dramatic thesis. Just one final line, centered near the bottom in 12-point font. Trust is not given. It's verified. No signature. No return address. It didn't need one. By the time the board received it, her name was already in the wind, tied to terms like pending investigation, breach of ethical practice, loss of fiduciary confidence. The whispers had become stories. The stories, questions. And there was no statement she could issue, no publicist she could pay, no clause she could cite that would unwrite what she'd done. Glenn didn't walk away from the wreckage. He erased the blueprints that built it. And he did it all without ever raising his voice, without ever breaking a dish, without ever stooping to her level. He just never opened the door. Because some things, once verified, don't need to be heard again.